Hours after the strike happened, U.S. Central Command posted a statement confirming that American forces had successfully employed multiple 5,000-pound deep penetrator munitions on hardened Iranian missile sites positioned along the coastline near the Strait of Hormuz. That's not a rough summary or a dramatized retelling. That's close to the actual language CENTCOM itself used, released directly through its own official channel that same evening. The weapon involved was the GBU-72, a bunker buster specifically engineered to punch through hardened or underground targets before detonating, and this strike marked one of several moments throughout this war where the United States reached specifically for this category of weapon rather than a conventional bomb. It's worth pausing right at the start to appreciate just how much technical and strategic weight sits behind a single sentence like that. A statement confirming the use of deep penetrator munitions isn't simply announcing that bombs were dropped. It's confirming that American commanders assessed a specific set of targets as hardened or buried deeply enough that ordinary weapons wouldn't reliably destroy them, and that they made a deliberate decision to commit some of the most specialized and expensive munitions in the entire American arsenal to solve that specific problem. So let's actually walk through why bunker busters in particular have become such a recurring and important tool throughout this entire conflict, what makes this specific class of weapon different from an ordinary bomb, and why the pattern of when and where these weapons keep getting used tells you a lot about how this war has actually been fought. Let's start with a specific strike that prompted this update, because the context behind it matters enormously. According to CENTCOM's own statement, the Iranian anti-ship cruise missiles stored at these particular sites posed a direct risk to international shipping transiting the strait. And that justification lines up with a broader crisis that had already been building for weeks by that point. Most shipping traffic through the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most important choke points for global oil and gas transport anywhere on the planet, had been effectively halted since early March, not long after this current phase of the war began. Roughly 20 vessels had already been attacked in the area by the time this specific bunker buster strike happened, and oil prices had jumped more than 40%, pushing above $100 a barrel as markets absorbed the reality that a waterway responsible for supplying roughly a fifth of the world's crude oil supply was no longer functioning anywhere close to normal capacity. Separate reporting around this same period described the strait as having been effectively closed by an Iranian blockade, relying on mines, drones, and armed vessels. A blockade serious enough that it was estimated to be halting something in the range of 27% of the world's global maritime energy movement. Against that backdrop, striking these specific coastal missile sites capable of threatening commercial vessels directly wasn't an abstract military exercise. It was aimed squarely at trying to restore the flow of one of the most economically important waterways on Earth. It's worth taking a moment to actually understand what makes the GBU-72 different from a standard bomb, because the engineering behind it explains exactly why American commanders reached for this specific weapon rather than something more conventional. This is officially classified as an advanced 5,000-pound penetrator, first developed under an Air Force program that began years before this war ever started, and it was formally tested and released by the Air Force for the first time back in 2021. Unlike an ordinary general-purpose bomb, which is designed to fragment and create blast damage immediately on impact, the GBU-72 is built specifically to survive the initial impact completely intact, driving downward through packed earth or reinforced concrete before a delayed fuse finally triggers detonation once the weapon has reached its intended depth. That distinction matters enormously when the target in question is something like an underground missile storage facility or a hardened coastal bunker, because a conventional bomb exploding on the surface might damage the entrance or the surrounding structure without actually reaching the stockpile or equipment buried underneath. The GBU-72 was engineered specifically to solve that exact problem, developed according to Air Force materials to overcome what officials describe as hardened, deeply buried target challenges, and built to be compatible with both fighter aircraft and larger bomber platforms, giving commanders flexibility in exactly how and from what altitude it gets delivered. That platform flexibility is genuinely significant from a tactical standpoint, and it's worth understanding why. A weapon that can only be carried by one specific type of aircraft, like the 30,000-pound GBU-57 that can only be delivered by the B-2 stealth bomber, inherently limits how often and how quickly it can realistically be used, since only a small number of B-2s exist in the entire American fleet, and each mission requires enormous logistical coordination just to get that aircraft safely to and from a target. The GBU-72, by contrast, being compatible with conventional fighter aircraft as well as larger bombers, means commanders can employ it far more routinely, using fighter jets already operating regularly in the theater, rather than needing to especially plan an entire mission around one of America's most limited and valuable strategic bomber assets. That difference in accessibility helps explain why the GBU-72 has shown up repeatedly and routinely throughout this war's coastal missile site campaign, while the far larger GBU-57 has been reserved specifically for the handful of targets judged serious enough to justify committing a B-2 bomber to the mission. Alongside that strike, Air Force B-1 bombers also dropped roughly 2,000-pound bombs specifically in support of that same rescue mission, illustrating just how many different weight classes and platforms of ordnance were being coordinated together in a single complex operation. It's worth widening the lens briefly here to note that this bunker-busting campaign hasn't been happening in complete isolation from a parallel Israeli military effort running alongside it throughout the same period. Around the same general stretch, when American forces were striking coastal missile sites and underground storage facilities, Israeli operations were separately reported to have killed Iran's intelligence minister, a senior official who had reportedly survived an earlier strike only to be killed in a subsequent one, illustrating just how sustained and multi-layered the pressure on Iran's senior leadership structure has been throughout this conflict from more than one direction simultaneously. That kind of coordinated, multi-front pressure, American bunker busters degrading physical infrastructure while separate Israeli operations target senior personnel directly, reflects a broader alliance strategy running throughout this entire war, one where different partners appear to be focusing on complementary categories of targets rather than duplicating each other's efforts. Just one day after that initial strike on the coastal missile sites, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, appearing at a Pentagon briefing alongside the Secretary of Defense, confirmed additional detail about how these penetrator weapons were being used. He described American forces dropping 5,000-pound penetrator weapons directly into underground storage facilities, specifically housing coastal defense cruise missiles and related support equipment, describing this as part of the broader operation running throughout this phase of the war. That confirmation matters, because it tells you this wasn't a single isolated strike happening in a vacuum. It was part of a deliberate, sustained targeting campaign specifically focused on Iran's underground missile storage infrastructure along its coastline, hit repeatedly over consecutive days rather than in a single symbolic gesture. Understanding that distinction, a sustained campaign rather than an isolated event, is really the key to appreciating why bunker busters specifically kept showing up throughout so many different chapters of this war, rather than being reserved purely for one dramatic, headline-grabbing moment that never gets repeated again. Because here's the thing that becomes clear once you actually trace the timeline of this conflict. Bunker busters weren't just used once. They became one of the defining tools of this entire war, deployed repeatedly against a whole range of different targets as this conflict evolved through its different phases. Around this same general stretch of fighting, American forces also struck a large Iranian ammunition depot in the city of Isfahan using a smaller class of bunker buster, 2,000-pound munitions, rather than the larger 5,000-pound GBU-72. With President Trump personally sharing footage of the strike showing both primary and secondary explosions rippling through the facility. Isfahan has functioned throughout this war as a central hub for Iran's broader military and nuclear infrastructure, making it exactly the kind of location where hardened, buried storage would be expected to hold significant stockpiles worth specifically targeting with penetrating munitions, rather than a standard bomb that might simply scatter debris across the surface without reaching what's actually stored underneath. A distinction that matters enormously once you understand how deliberately Iran chose to build so much of its most sensitive capability underground in the first place. The pattern continued escalating from there. Roughly 2.5 months later, in the middle of an active operation to rescue an American navigator whose aircraft had gone down inside Iranian territory, the commander overseeing Central Command's entire theater of operations ordered a strike on an underground headquarters belonging to Iran's Revolutionary Guard, located near Tehran itself. That mission was carried out using B-2 stealth bombers, and this time the weapon involved wasn't the 5,000-pound GBU-72, but the far larger 30,000-pound GBU-57, sometimes referred to informally as the mother of all conventional bombs given its sheer scale. According to reporting on that specific strike, the underground headquarters was destroyed, marking one of the most significant single strikes against Iran's military command structure throughout this entire conflict, executed in the middle of an already high-stakes personnel recovery operation happening simultaneously in the same general theater. That same rescue operation also involved Air Force B-1 bombers dropping roughly 2,000-pound bombs in direct support of the mission, illustrating just how many different weight classes and platforms of ordnance were being coordinated together in a single, complex operation. That same 30,000-pound GBU-57, the massive ordnance penetrator, had already made history earlier in this war during an operation that came to be known as Operation Midnight Hammer. And understanding that earlier strike helps explain exactly why commanders were comfortable reaching for the exact same weapon again months later against the IRGC headquarters near Tehran. During that original operation, American forces used more than a dozen of these massive bombs, each one weighing 30,000 pounds and costing millions of dollars to produce, to strike 3 of Iran's most significant nuclear facilities in a single coordinated overnight mission. According to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, 7 B-2 bombers flew 14 of these weapons from their home base in Missouri all the way to Iran and back, though more than 125 aircraft in total were involved in supporting that single mission when you account for refueling tankers, escort aircraft, and everything else required to get those bombers safely to their targets and home again. That specific operation was described as the largest B-2 operational strike in American history and the second longest B-2 mission ever flown, an almost unbelievable statistic given how many decades this particular stealth bomber has already been in active service. That specific operation was described as the largest B-2 operational strike in American history and the second longest B-2 mission ever flown, an almost unbelievable statistic given how many decades this particular stealth bomber has already been in active service. It's worth noting how isolated this specific bunker-busting effort was in terms of Allied participation, because that isolation itself became a point of public friction throughout this war. President Trump publicly criticized NATO allies during roughly this same period for failing to provide meaningful support to the broader operation, singling out the fact that not a single minesweeper had been contributed by allied nations, despite the severity of the naval mining campaign disrupting shipping through the strait. Separate reporting described most NATO allies as reluctant to get directly involved in the Iran operation at all, with American officials publicly stating that the United States never actually needed that outside help to execute strikes like the ones described throughout this story. That dynamic, a war effort carried almost entirely by American air power and munitions, with only limited direct Allied military contribution, adds another layer of context to understanding just how much weight rested specifically on American bunker-busting capability throughout this conflict, since there wasn't a broad coalition sharing the burden of degrading Iran's hardened infrastructure in the way earlier multinational conflicts in the region had typically been structured. Each of these weapons measures around 20 feet long and spans about 6 feet at its widest point, giving you a real physical sense of scale for a bomb heavy enough to require an entire dedicated aircraft design specifically capable of carrying and delivering it. Before ever being used in actual combat, the Air Force had only tested this weapon 5 times at White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico. 3 of those tests using live warheads and 2 using inert versions, meaning the strikes against Iran's nuclear facilities represented the very first time this weapon had ever been used outside of a carefully controlled testing environment. Once you lay out that full sequence, the coastal missile site strikes with the 5,000-pound GBU-72. The ammunition depot hit with 2,000-pound bombs in Isfahan. The underground missile storage facilities, specifically confirmed by the Joint Chiefs Chairman, the IRGC headquarters near Tehran destroyed with the 30,000-pound GBU-57. And the original nuclear facility strikes that first proved this weapon could actually work in real combat conditions, a clear pattern emerges. This war has effectively become a demonstration of tiered bunker-busting capability, with American commanders selecting a specific weight class of penetrator based on exactly how deep and how hardened a particular target happens to be. A relatively shallow ammunition depot gets hit with a 2,000-pound weapon. A moderately hardened coastal missile storage site gets hit with the 5,000-pound GBU-72. And the deepest, most heavily fortified targets, an underground Revolutionary Guard Command headquarters or Iran's most protected nuclear enrichment facilities, get the full 30,000-pound treatment that only a B-2 stealth bomber can actually deliver. That tiered approach reflects a deliberate strategic calculation rather than random escalation, using exactly enough weapon to guarantee penetration and destruction of a given target without unnecessarily burning through the extremely limited and expensive stockpile of the largest bombs on targets that a smaller, cheaper penetrator could handle just as effectively, a form of resource discipline that becomes increasingly important the longer any sustained air campaign like this one continues to run. It's worth pausing here to consider the economics behind that calculation too, because cost genuinely factors into how these decisions get made even in the middle of an active war. Every single GBU-57 costs millions of dollars to produce, and the total American inventory of these specific weapons has always been understood to be limited, produced in relatively small numbers, given both the enormous expense involved and the narrow set of targets anywhere in the world that would actually require that level of penetrating power. A scarcity that shapes targeting decisions just as much as pure tactical necessity does. Separate reporting throughout this period confirmed that an Iranian heavy water production plant, a facility with genuine relevance to certain pathways toward nuclear weapons development, had been damaged and rendered inoperable following strikes earlier in this conflict, according to assessments from the United Nations' own nuclear watchdog agency,